Affairs Committee here at the New York City Bar. We co-sponsored tonight's event with our colleagues from the European Union Studies Center at the Graduate Center of CUNY, the City University of New York, and we're very happy to welcome those of you who are in the audience from CUNY as well. So we begin our program tonight with a welcome. We hope that you enjoy, and more, we hope that you gain something from our discussion tonight to take home with you. And because we're going to be talking for many hours, and if you do need to get up and move around, our custom here in the house is to help yourself as you need to, and then come back to your seat and continue. So there won't be a formal break necessarily, unless we're setting up with a PowerPoint for one of the speakers. All right, so feel free to move around if you need to. All right. Our panel tonight will focus on present and future migration into Europe. Ever-increasing numbers of people are in transit through North Africa en route to Spain and Italy from the Middle East, en route to Greece and Bulgaria, facing untold dangers, risking death, trying to reach Europe. Those desperate to leave their homes around the world may be fleeing armed conflicts, gender-based violence, religious persecution, natural disasters and the effects of climate change, and economic crises, seeking safety, stability, and opportunity in Europe. Yet to what extent is current migration a benefit to the destination states, and to what extent is it a social and humanitarian crisis, trying to absorb everyone into Europe who wants to come, or resettling those who manage to cross the external borders of the EU, who wish to move away from the states where they entered, into more northern European countries? What are the laws and policies that govern people in these situations? Tonight we will hear of these realities, the architecture of the institutions, laws, and regulations that exist on the European Union level and in European states, and the challenges and responses from other parts of the world. The panelists may suggest gaps in law and policy that need to be filled, including the articulation of a comprehensive, common European Union migration or immigration policy, and expanded and expedited asylum procedures. We invite you to learn from and share the experience and the thoughtful consideration of the issues that will be offered tonight by our panelists. Listen as they interact with each other, and have your questions ready for the end of the program. And we invite you to return for another program next year, October 2015, when the European Union Studies Center and the European Affairs Committee of the New York City Bar will continue to explore today's patterns of global migration and mobility as the defining characteristic of our era. Our format will be to hear from each of our speakers in the order in your program, beginning with His Excellency Ambassador Inigo Lambertini, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Italy to the United Nations. We are particularly honored by your presence here tonight, Mr. Ambassador, as Italy holds the presidency of the European Union at this time. And it is a great opportunity for us to hear about the responses of Italy to this situation, to the increasing numbers of migrants pouring into your country, as well as to what your country is doing in the EU presidency in relation to these issues. So if I may introduce you a little further about your accomplishments, Ambassador Lambertini has been in his post in New York this year, coinciding with this dramatic growth in the number of migrants seeking entrance into Europe, particularly through Italy. The press has been full of these stories. You've all seen the pictures. You know what the issues look like that we've seen in the media. But Ambassador Lambertini has the hands-on experience. He has served in various positions in the Foreign Ministry at Rome and at the OECD in Paris, where he was Deputy Permanent Representative of Italy as well. And during his distinguished diplomatic career, Ambassador Lambertini has been posted to Brussels, Washington, Paris, Kinshasa, and Brasilia. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to stay here, and welcome to my fellow participants. If you allow me with a special special welcome to the two Brazilian colleagues because they are the result of the successful migration, the Italian migration to Brazil. It happens some decades ago. And actually, I would like to start from here. I would like to stress, I mean, everybody knows, especially people who live here in New York, that my country is built on migration. The history of my country is built on migration. Basically, the history of Rome started with the forced migration of Sabine people to Rome to give women to the first warriors. And if we take on the fall of the Roman Empire, yes, of course, there were battles and other issues, but basically the Roman Empire fall because of the illegal migration from outside the empire. So this is part of the history of my country. And we actually, we have migrated in all the world. And my country, I think, it's a typical country. It's the only country that has huge community of the grand zone of Italians that live in all America, not only in the north, but also in the south of America. Normally, people say that in North America there are the Anglo-Saxon and the south are the Latin, but Italian are everywhere. This is absolutely incredible. And to end this, just this, remember, I was very touched when I was in Washington. I went to the Ellis Island Museum. There is this huge Italian section of the museum. And there is a phrase that was written by the Sicilian immigrants to this mother that I think explains the history of the Italian migration. Basically, the phrase is said in Sicilian, said, Mama, I went to America because I thought that in America there were the streets paved by gold. And then I arrived here and I discovered that the streets were not paved by gold. Actually, I discovered the streets, they were not paved at all, and they are waiting me to pave the streets. And this is what's happening. So it's important to say this because to understand what's happening today in the Mediterranean, in Europe in general, we have to remember that migration is part of our culture. Say that, I have to stress that, of course, I will speak on a personal basis because I'm a diplomat, so not necessarily what I say is the official position of the Italian government. I also would like to stress that there are a lot of use of the migration issues just for political agenda points in Italy as in other countries. For instance, today it's very common to accuse the European Union not to be really on the point of this argument. I have to say, this is my personal feeling, but also the feeling of my government, that actually, if we are not part of the European Union situation, we've been even worse. And what is doing today in Brussels, of course, it was a lot more, but in a lot of activity, we do a lot more. What is doing at Brussels, it's really a big effort together with Rome, Madrid, Valletta, Athens, the 4 countries that are linked with this phenomenon. In the last few years, actually, Italy and Europe have witnessed a huge increase in incoming mixed migration. And this is important to say mixed migration, basically economic migrants and potential asylum seekers. Just some number to give you. From January to August of this year, there were the entrance of 161,184 irregular migrants, legal migrants in Europe. In the same period of last year, there were 3,100,000. And in all, in 2013, there were known 4,200,925 illegal migrants. That means that just at the end of August, we have 3 times the number of people than last year entering. And another important element to stress is that all this number of people, just 10% entered not by sea. This was in the past the most common way to enter in Europe. Basically, it's also the common way to enter the United States. You have a visa, for instance, a tourist visa, then you arrive, you don't let the country, and you remain in Europe. This was what's happening, especially during the 90s, with the migration from the eastern part of Europe. At that stage was not part of the European Union. This year, we see a diminution of more than 25% people coming from by land from East Europe and Eastern region, not part of the European Union. Almost minus 40% of people coming from Balkans, and plus 473% of people who arrive from sea. Basically, the 90% of people who until today, from January 1st, entering illegally in Europe, came from the sea. The great majority of these people came from the central Mediterranean part of the sea, so just in front of Italy. Actually, we had from January until 9 October, so some days ago, we have registered 145,600 entrants by sea to Italy. This number, the same period last year, there were 3,300,000 people. The great majority of these people came from Libya. And in a very different identification. Basically, more than 1/3 are unidentified, people with no documents, not ready to be identified. 24% came from Eritrea, because everybody thinks that it's the so-called Arab Spring that created the situation, but we still registered a quarter of people came from Eritrea. And for the people who arrive in Eritrea from Italy means that they cross South Sudan, Libya, Chad. So if they arrive in this number, imagine how many people lost the path for arrive here. 11% came from Syria, 7% from Mali, 4% from Nigeria, and 3.75% from Gambia. Another very scary phenomenon that's happening this year is a huge increase of unaccompanied minors. There are around 6,000 unaccompanied minors, that means young children with no relatives at all, that arrived in Italy. 3 times what's happened in the last years. Again, they are from Eritrea a lot, but also from Egypt, Somalia, and Gambia again. This is the picture of what is happening today. The problem is that this picture takes in account just the people who arrived in Italy. But there are a lot of people who lost their lives. They don't arrive to Italy. Because the reality is that this journey is very, very dangerous. Just a few days ago, we have remembered an official ceremony, also very touching ceremony, 1 year from the so-called Lampedusa tragedy that's happened in October 3rd, 2013, where there was more than 300 people who died just in front of this teeny island that was called Lampedusa. That it's a beautiful place. It's a very teeny island, Italian teeny island, south from Tunis. It's beautiful island. Until some years ago, it was very kept secret for people who loved a specific place to spend their vacation, in sea vacation. It was also known because maybe some of you remember one of the masterpieces of Italian literature is the Leopard. And the Leopard was written by Giuseppe Tommasi Principe di Lampedusa. It was an ancient member of the ancient Sicilian family that owned this island. Today, this island is an island of still beautiful, but an island where the local population made a proof of generosity and capacity and all was possible to give some rest to people who arrived to the island, but also an island of very safe situation in use. After this accident, Basically, in the last year, we have deployed a humanitarian mission. It's called Mare Nostrum. It's built on naval units, it's built on aircraft, helicopters that have rescued in more or less 1 year around 100,000 migrants. So people that the big difference in this action is not only an action for search, for rescue migrants, but also it's an operation to search the migrants. It's a more proactive action that helped to save a lot of lives in the sea. Mare Nostrum also gave a little less pressure to the island of Lampedusa, because basically it was built on the fact that our unit, when they found migrants in the sea, they transferred directly to the Sicily, to the main island, in 3-4 different places. The number of people is so huge that our system of welcoming these people and to put in a good condition basically collapsed. Actually, there are some serious problem of receiving, because the number are really very, very high, and as maybe you know, it's not one of the most better moments in the life of Italy. We are in the middle of a serious economic crisis, and this operation cost I don't want to say it's not, but basically it's very expensive. I have also the red figure. It costs 9 million of euro per month. So basically Italy, in the middle of a very financial turmoil, has spent almost 100 million of euro in operation. This operation is going to finish now. It's going to finish now because we have no more means to do this, so we have a limited means. And also to finish now also because with the new European Commission that will start on November 1st, there will be a more coordinated action by the European Union. I'm sure that you will say something about this. I just want, like, there are a lot of things that I can see, but I don't want to be expulsed by the podium. So I just want to stress one aspect typical, that is the Libya and the situation, and the current situation. Why Libya is a problem? Well, Libya is a problem for a lot of reasons. I don't need to elaborate on this, but basically the main reason is that people who arrive from Libya now, they cannot be sent back like happens in other countries. Italy and Europe have bilateral agreements, for instance, with all the countries of Western Africa, that when you have illegal migrants arriving in the country, you can send back in the country. In Libya it's impossible. In Libya there is no government, no authorities, no diplomacy, that's today very heavy wearing Benghazi. So this is one of the reasons also, because everybody comes now from Libya. And everybody now comes from Libya because they are also victims of criminal organization with no scruples. There are poor people that pay an amount of money unbelievable for their resources. Nothing will change. They change also the risk of losing their lives or the lives of their relatives during this incredible sea trip. We have officially asked to the Libyan authority to sign the Geneva Convention on Refugees, but until then we do not have a clear, central and officially recognized Libyan government in charge. It will be impossible to have any agreements. And so the picture became, of course, more gloomy because we don't know when it's happening. I want to conclude also with another element of the scale. What is happening today in Syria and the region of Iraq is also some consequences in the rest of the northern Africa. Libya is one of the best cases to become the next Islamic State, or at least to become a heaven for terrorist organization or whatever you want to call the people that now are fighting in Syria. Maybe when there will be the situation, this sad phenomenon of migration will be over. But this will be over just because all the Libyans will be prisoners or something different. And this is something that we have to think about, also how to solve this problem and to give some hope to these people. I think at the time I'm ready, of course, to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lambertini, for these words, giving us a sense of the reality that your country is facing, the globe faces, the challenges ahead. For the next response, I would like to ask Ursula Wojciechowska, who is an attorney with the European Parliament, the liaison office in Washington, D.C. to the U.S. Congress. And she is going to give us a background into the issues of compétence between the European Union and the various member states, and to give us an understanding of what EU laws and policies exist to try to address this growing crisis, where the gaps are and what can be done. All of that in a few minutes' time. We're very honored that you're here too from Washington. Thank you. Ms. Wojciechowska graduated from the Faculty of Law and Administration at the University of Warsaw, Poland, with a master's degree in law, studied English and European law at Cambridge University. Then she began her career as a corporate lawyer. So there is hope for those of you who are in corporate law firms. You too could end up working for an intergovernmental or a governmental agency. All right. After her litigation career, she joined the European Court of Justice as a civil servant. And then for the past 6 years has been working with the European Parliament, first with the Directorate General for the Presidency of the European Parliament, then as a staffer at the Budgetary Control Committee, and since July of 2013 in the Washington, D.C. liaison office to the U.S. Congress. And there her portfolio includes a wide spectrum of EU internal policies, including issues related to measures concerning the entry and movement of persons, asylum, and migration in the European Union. I welcome Ms. Ursula Wojciechowska.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this introduction. I would like to thank the European Affairs Committee and the European Union Studies Center for inviting me to speak at this panel. As Catherine rightfully mentioned, I represent the European Parliament office in Washington, D.C. By way of background, the European Parliament is the legislative and budgetary authority of the European Union, and our office is, for the moment, the only liaison office set up by the Parliament outside of the European Union. I am myself an attorney, and I have to say that I feel very much at home in places like this. So thank you very much. I'm also coming from a country of migrants. I'm Polish, and my ancestors have fled Poland at different times, at different difficult times in our history, and a lot of them have settled in the United States. So I'm particularly happy to be able to speak here. So, to understand where the EU stands in terms of its migration policy, it is very important to note that the actual concept of the EU migration policy is a fairly recent one. Issues related to asylum, immigration, and visa policy were integrated into the EU law only in 1999, with the entry into force of the Treaty of Amsterdam, with which some of you perhaps are familiar. The Treaty of Lisbon, which entered into force 10 years later, established the creation of the area of freedom, security, and justice. So the migration into the EU is regulated by a combination of EU law, national laws, the European Convention on Human Rights, to which all 28 member states are party, the European Social Charter, and all other international obligations that the European states and the EU have entered into. Compared to other EU laws and policies, the field of migration has a number of very specific characteristics. Well, first of all, as I said, migration law and policy fall under the EU competence to establish the area of freedom, security, and justice. And the treaties specify that in establishing that area, the Union acts on the basis of shared competence with the member states. What does shared competence mean? Shared competence means that member states and the EU are authorized to adopt binding acts in a given field. However, member states may exercise their competence only insofar as the EU has not exercised or has decided not to exercise its own competence. Moreover, the area of freedom, security, and justice is a very peculiar field of shared competence. Firstly, because the member states enjoy a very large discretion with regard to immigration control, and in particular with regards to conditions of admission to the national territory. They also remain exclusively responsible with regard to the maintenance of law and order and safeguarding of internal security. Secondly, it is a field in which not all EU countries participate to an equal extent. The UK, Ireland, and Denmark do not fully participate in these common policies. And on the other hand, some non-EU countries are associated with the development of the area of freedom, security, and justice. And by these countries, I mean Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. Further, UK, Ireland, Bulgaria, Romania, and Cyprus are not parties to the Schengen agreements, which I will mention later, so that the intra-EU migration to these countries continues to be subject to border controls. But according to the treaties, the EU should develop a common immigration policy. And for that purpose, the European Parliament and the Council are the governments of the member states, are called upon to legislate on the conditions of entry and residence and standards on the issue by member states of long-term visas and residence permits, the definition of the rights of non-EU nationals residing legally in a member state, including the conditions governing freedom of movement and of residence in other member states, illegal immigration and unauthorized residence, and combating trafficking in persons. And all this should be governed by the principle of solidarity and of fair sharing of responsibility, including financial implications between the member states. What is very important to mention is that integration measures remain in principle with the competence of the member states. Under the EU treaties, there is no legislative competence for harmonization of integration legislation. The EU may only establish measures in order to promote integration, for instance by financial support or policy programs. Now, acting within that competence, the EU has enacted quite a substantial number of directives and regulations in the area of immigration as well as the asylum law. The immigration has turned out to be more difficult than asylum, particularly with regard to the issue of access of third country nationals to member states and their rights within the EU. European immigration legislation, however, does not imply a replacement of member state sovereignty to grant entry and residence to their territories. There is no such thing as a residence permit for the EU as such. There is no competence or legislative rule which enables the EU to provide for a residence permit for all EU member states. Therefore, when speaking about the EU immigration policy, one needs to keep in mind the restrictions of the very concept. Now, most of you will certainly know that Europe has a Schengen area, an area without any type of control and the internal borders of participating countries. The entry into that area is governed by the Schengen Borders Code, which is a code that provides for a set of common rules that govern external borders, checks on persons, entry requirements, and duration of stay in the Schengen area. Visit up to 3 months in states part of the Schengen area are subject to the visa code. And member states also establish a list of countries for which the requirement of visa to enter into the Schengen area is waived. The European Commission, the executive body of the EU and one which proposes legislation, would like to achieve the ambitious goal of full harmonization of the immigration and asylum policy. And this, in principle, is covered by the legislative competence of the EU, provided that the subsidiarity principle has been complied with. And this one needs to be explained as well. The subsidiarity principle requires that the Union, in areas which are not falling within their exclusive competence, will take measures only insofar as the aims of those measures cannot be achieved by member states on the central, regional, or local level. In 2009, the European Council, the heads of states of the member states, adopted the Stockholm Programme. It is a multi-annual program for measures to be taken in the area of freedom, security, and justice, including the EU's migration policy priorities. Under this program, a number of legislative acts have been adopted. For example, the asylum package. The Stockholm Programme will come to an end in December 2014. In March 2014, the European Commission already came up with a new communication and with new ideas for the new program, which were the basis for strategic guidelines adopted by the European Council in June 2014. As yet, there is no official position of the European Parliament on those documents. However, it is very important to mention that the European Council has underlined the need for a comprehensive approach to immigration, optimizing the benefits of legal migration and offering protection to those in need. The European Council stressed the importance of an effective management of the EU external borders. They called upon the European Union to support member states' efforts to pursue active integration policies. They clearly stated that the full transposition and effective implementation of the common European asylum system is an absolute priority. They supported the global approach to migration and mobility proposed by the Commission in order to address the root causes of irregular migration flows. And they called for the common visa policy to be modernized by facilitating legitimate travel and reinforce local Schengen consular cooperation. Now, the focus of this panel is on the issues of illegal migration and asylum, which are the most pressing ones at the moment. However, one should not underestimate the importance of law and policy on legal migration, which is part of the global approach to migration and mobility. There are a number of legislative tools which have been put into place in the EU. The discussions on horizontal legislation covering all labor immigration into the EU have proven difficult, and therefore the current approach consists in adopting sectoral legislation. I can mention here the Blue Card Directive for this highly skilled workers, the Single Permit Directive, Seasonal Workers Directive, Intra-Corporate Transfer Directive, which is still in the making, the proposal for a directive on entry to the EU for the purposes of study or research. Now, on common asylum policy, the Lisbon Treaty provides the legal basis for a common asylum policy. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights actually provides for a right to asylum in its Article 18 and the prohibition of refoulement. However, although the right to asylum is granted, the EU law does not provide for ways to facilitate the arrival of asylum seekers. Obviously, asylum seekers often would not qualify for ordinary visa, and that's why they cross the border in irregular manners. The European asylum architecture is referred to as the Common European Asylum System. It is composed of a number of documents, of which the most discussed one is, of course, the Dublin III regulation, which is a successor to the Dublin II regulation, not surprisingly, which follows from the Dublin Convention signed in 1990. So the new regulation became applicable on 1st January 2014 and seeks to improve conditions for persons seeking asylum in Europe. The regulation establishes the criteria for determining which member state is responsible for examining an application for international protection under the Geneva Convention and applicable EU law, that is the Qualification Directive. The core principle of the Dublin regulation is that the responsibility for examining a claim for asylum lies in the first place with the member state which played the greatest part in the applicant's entry or residence in the EU. The criteria for establishing responsibility run from family considerations to recent possession of visa or residence permit in a member state, to whether the applicant has entered the EU irregularly or regularly. If no responsible member state can be identified on the basis of such criteria, the first member state in which the asylum application was lodged will be responsible for examining it. The purpose of the regulation is to avoid the phenomenon of refugees in orbit, that is, asylum seekers for which no member state wants to take responsibility, and to prevent multiple asylum applications, the so-called asylum shopping. As a consequence to the Dublin rules, the EU's external borders, and in particular member states on the EU's southern and eastern borders, are most heavily affected by asylum applications in proportion to their population. This has led many to criticize the Dublin rules for placing responsibility for asylum seekers on member states particularly hard hit by the economic crisis. There have also been some violations of asylum seekers' human rights. Since the adoption of the Dublin system, several stakeholders and academics have criticized that asylum seekers are automatically transferred to the member state responsible under the system, without an examination of the risks which they may face in the destination member state. This presumption of the safe country has been challenged both by the European Court of Human Rights and by the Court of Justice of the European Union. The latter held that this presumption is rebutted when there are systemic deficiencies in asylum procedures and in the reception conditions of asylum seekers. In fact, the 2008 Commission proposal for a Dublin III regulation envisaged a possible suspension of the Dublin rules in such cases. However, the Council refused to agree to a suspension clause and instead argued for an early warning mechanism to prevent pressure on member states' asylum systems. This aims to make it easier to detect problems in a member state's asylum system so that the early assistance can be provided by the EU Commission and the European Asylum Support Office. This early warning mechanism is seen by many as insufficient, since it does not provide an immediate response to shortcomings in the protection of fundamental rights. However, as no solution is ever perfect, the suspension mechanism has been criticized for needing documented cases of human rights violations, or even judicial decisions, before the suspension clause can be invoked. Some even warn that the suspension mechanism could work as a reward for member states which do not comply with EU asylum legislation. However, the new regulation does provide some enhanced safeguards for asylum applicants in Europe, including provisions that while waiting for a decision on their appeal, the individual has the right to remain in the country. A clause designed to avoid human rights breaches whereby a state will not be permitted to transfer a person if there is a risk that he or she will be subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment in another member state. This means that from now on, member states will be obliged to undertake their own assessment of the situation, rather than continuing to apply the Dublin rules until the European courts give a decision to the contrary. As I mentioned before, a new system to monitor whether member states are correctly implementing EU asylum laws is in place, the early warning mechanism, and there's an enhanced focus on respect for family life. There's a right to a personal interview as well. It remains to be seen how effective Dublin III will be at addressing the problems and protection gaps that existed under the previous framework. How well this will all work in practice is now largely in the hands of the member states, who are, of course, the ones who implement it. I would like to mention here briefly, I'm trying to mention so many things, you have no idea how many legal acts have been put in place by the EU. So I would like to mention the common EU rules for managing the return of irregular migrants. We have the so-called Return Directive, and because I have little time, I will not elaborate on it. Because I would like to elaborate on the financial dimension of the EU migration policy. So the EU provides financial support to member states under particular migration pressure. The 4 funds in this area, including the External Borders Fund and the European Refugee Fund, will be replaced by a new Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, with a total budget for 2014-2020 of 3.1 billion euros. Member states will be obliged to allocate at least 20% of the funds to asylum measures and another 20% to support legal migration and promote the integration of migrants. In a statement accompanying the regulation, the Parliament stresses that the fund, as well as other instruments, need also to be based on the principle of solidarity. Further on solidarity, overburdening of some member states, including Italy, can only be tackled by greater EU support and solidarity from those member states who are less affected. However, solidarity remains subject to the conflicting interests of member states. In this context, Mediterranean member states have repeatedly called for fair distribution of asylum seekers among member states. Currently, there is an ad hoc EU relocation program in place, EUREMA II project, with member states volunteering, but only reluctantly, to take asylum seekers. The European Commission remains fully behind the policy of relocation. It encourages strongly member states to take part to relocation measures. The Commission intends, under the Asylum and Migration and Integration Fund, to provide a lump sum of cash to governments that relocate beneficiaries of international protection as an incentive. In March 2002, the EU adopted a joint resettlement program. It is a EU-wide resettlement scheme which is meant to help member states, again, on a voluntary basis, to find suitable and sustainable solutions for refugees. Calls from the European Parliament to establish a permanent relocation mechanism have met opposition from several member states, which fear that relocation might become a pull factor for migrants. The EU provides support to member states under pressure of migration through its Frontex agency and the European Asylum Support Office. Frontex coordinates joint operations, and if requested by a member state, can deploy rapid border interventions, the so-called RAPIDs, through European border guard teams. As from 1st November 2014, the Frontex coordinated joint Operation Triton will start its activity in the central Mediterranean in support of the Italian efforts. And lastly, I would like to briefly mention the role of the European Parliament in the EU migration policy. The European Parliament has always actively supported the introduction of a European immigration policy. On the admission of third country nationals, it has called for the development of legal means, and in particular, measures to reduce incentives for irregular migration. It has always demanded full respect of fundamental rights. It has repeatedly pointed out to refoulement and collective expulsions to countries where human rights are not respected. The Parliament has repeatedly stressed the importance of addressing the needs of the most vulnerable groups, such as refugees and minors. It has always called for more solidarity between the member states. However, many of its efforts, for example, a call for a permanent relocation mechanism, have met opposition from several member states. It is also important to underline, once more, that the Parliament's legislative role in this field goes back only to 2009. And the European legislation in the field of immigration can only be as good as the consensus between the Parliament and the governments of the member states. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. In such a complex subject in such a short amount of time, it's really impressive. Thank you. We'll have you back. You see the dimensions of the problem when you try to decide who is responsible, just as one of our big questions tonight to put out there to everyone. Now I would like to introduce Ambassador Ronald Jumeau of the Seychelles, who is the roving ambassador for climate change and small island developing states, known as SIDS, in the United Nations Parliaments. And I'd like to also thank Ambassador Jumeau for the genesis of this idea tonight, that led to this program, when I heard him speak at the United Nations last winter on the subject that he is going to address us on tonight. So with no further ado, let me give you a little background on Ambassador Jumeau. He previously served as the permanent representative of the Seychelles to the United Nations and ambassador to the United States, Canada, and Brazil. And this was not intentional that both ambassadors have been in Brazil, but if I had tried, I couldn't have done better. Trained as a journalist, Ambassador Jumeau is known for his insights into the politics and science of climate change, oceans, and other environmental issues particularly affecting small island developing states, and the important organizing efforts of AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, as well as being chair of the steering committee of the Global Island Partnership. And in this capacity, he's been very effective at the meetings of the United Nations Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals the past year and a half at the United Nations, and the Climate Change Summit, and the work leading up to the Paris Summit in December 2015. So I give you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening, everyone. I will come at this subject from a different direction, but first of all, I'd like to thank the New York City Bar Association and the European Union Study Center, and especially Catherine, for inviting me here to speak tonight. As she said, it was just remarks I made at the UN at an event that she was attending that led to what we're talking about today. I come from Seychelles, and based on what I heard during the reception, I might as well tell you, Seychelles is one of the 12 smallest countries in the world. We have a population of 90,000. We are a republic of the east coast of Africa in the western Indian Ocean. I'm also chief spokesperson for the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. The Alliance groups together 38 independent countries, island countries here at the UN, that spread all around the world, in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic off the coast of West Africa, in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa and India, in the South China Seas, and in the Pacific. And I'm going to talk about how climate change migration may fuel the rise of the radical right in Europe. Now, climate change is a new driver of human migration that many people expect will dwarf all others on this planet. However bad you think the situation is now, especially when we see what's happening in the Mediterranean, it's going to get worse, much worse. And Europe has to prepare for it. UK Shadow Immigration Minister Chris Bryant quoted only last year the UN statistic that 200 million people may be forced to flee their countries due to climate change by 2050. Now, the European Union, we feel in the islands of Small Island States and in Seychelles, has the opportunity to create a humane and functioning immigration and asylum system. And we just heard about the difficulties of getting something like this together, that is fit for purpose, and which can avoid the distress and death of thousands of persons en route to Europe. Last month, the International Organization for Migration reported that 3,072 migrants have drowned in the Mediterranean so far this year, out of a worldwide total of 4,077 deaths. Pope Francis, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, European politicians such as the President of the European Commission, Juan Manuel Barroso, the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs, Cecilia Malmström, they all joined in a chorus of condemnation and called on Europe and the international community to take action to prevent such tragedies in the future. A few weeks ago, Germany's Interior Minister, Thomas de Maizière, pushed for changes to Europe's refugee policies in an effort to share the burden across the continent as the number of asylum seekers in Germany continues to grow rapidly. In the interest of time, and because the DPR, the ambassador from Italy who spoke before me, gave a lot of figures, I will not give the figures that I have, but suffice it to say that Italy, Germany, Sweden, France, and Britain get 70% of all asylum applications in Europe. Ministers in all these countries have repeatedly and so far fruitlessly sought EU involvement in dealing with the Mediterranean influx. So we believe, and we would call on Europe, situation worsens, because that's all that's going to happen. It's only going to worsen. Whether you solve the problems in Syria or Northern Africa, we're not on track to solve the problems of climate change. So we feel the EU should set up rules on how and when to provide refuge and protection, including during increasingly severe climate-related disasters. However, not only has practical follow-through on promises to do so been limited, but the rise of the radical right across Europe has meant that immigration flows continue to tighten, and the attitude to incoming migrants is all too frequently negative at best and hostile at worst. However, no specific link has yet been made between climate change and migration into Europe. Indeed, as the ambassador explained, most of the refugees risking death in the Mediterranean are fleeing conflict in Syria, the Gaza Strip, and Libya, to name some, and poverty and strife further afield in Africa, as we heard. However, I think it would be safe to say that as climate change forces people to relocate, it will only worsen the situation. The latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Fifth Assessment of AR5 report, the IPCC provides the official science that we base the climate change negotiations on. And as anyone will tell you, it is the most conservative science, since it involves government scientists around the world and they have to reach agreement on what is written. So very often the science outside of the IPCC is much worse than what is actually in the report. However, the report states in its current chapter on human security that long-term environmental change, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and loss of agricultural productivity will have a significant impact on migration flows. And here we're not just talking to Europe, we're talking globally. It must be admitted, the evidence in this area suggests that extreme weather events are not necessarily associated with displacement and can also be associated with immobility or in-migration. Changing economic structures can shape the ability of affected populations to cope with extreme weather without being displaced. Researchers Modreux and Barnett found that migration from Tuvalu, and it is widely believed amongst the small island states and in the climate change community, that Tuvalu will be the first country to be wiped off the face of this earth by climate change. So they found that even in Tuvalu, that migration was not driven by perceptions of climate change, and that despite forecasts that the island could become uninhabitable, residents have remained for reasons of culture and identity. We see this on US TV all the time. Whenever there are tornadoes that destroy homes, what do the people always say? We are going to rebuild. They always say, this is a human reaction, not just small islands. The day will come when they will have to relocate, because the cost in human lives and property will be just too great to bear. At this point, I'd just like to point out that Tuvalu, population around 12,000, the atoll of Kiribati, these are the Pacific ones, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, and the Maldives in the Indian Ocean are the 4 countries which will be the first to disappear entirely. Never in human history have countries disappeared. They've been carved up. They no longer exist because the frontiers don't exist, but the territory is still there. We are approaching the time in human history where countries will totally disappear. Now the people of Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Marshall Islands will probably end up in Australia and or New Zealand. The people of Maldives, a toss-up between whether they would end up in India or Sri Lanka. So it is not just an issue of Europe. So why am I talking about European politics? One is because it's in the news, especially what's happening in the Mediterranean and the problems Italy is facing. Secondly, the European Union, amongst the developed countries, the major emitters in the developed countries, which include European Union, the US, Japan, Australia, has traditionally been in the climate change negotiations the closest allies of the small island developing states. They have traditionally been, until recently, and they could become again, the most progressive, most proactive major emitters when it comes to cutting emissions, when it comes to taking action and providing assistance to small island states. So we have, the reason for example I'm talking about this is because they are the people who listen to us the most. Although we are not necessarily amongst the islands, the people are going to necessarily end up in Europe. So there is significant resistance to relocation, even where such options are well planned and have robust justifications, as demonstrated by Marino for relocation in Alaska, for example, which is threatened by climate change as much as the small islands. Indeed, many small island countries are reluctant to have their international migrants designated as victims of climate change, partly because, from a scientific point of view, it is very difficult to prove that people have actually been displaced by climate change. People have been migrating from small islands for centuries, mainly economic reasons, sometimes political, and they've been absorbed, especially in Australia and New Zealand, more as a migrant problem for looking for jobs and that sort of thing. But more and more, once they accept these people, they know the people that they're accepting as migrants will not go home. In the past, they would. Now they're probably thinking there won't be much to go home to. Another reason, something I'm well aware of, have been involved in, another reason small island countries are reluctant to have their migrants designated as victims of climate change is the fear that this will ease pressure on countries, especially reluctant major emitters, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we have, especially the Pacific members of the Alliance of Small Island States, have resisted in the climate negotiations talking about climate migration or relocation or whatever way you want to go. We don't like the term climate refugee either. Because until now, a refugee is someone who has a land to go back to. Is fleeing poverty or persecution or strife, but they have a country to go back to. So that is a problem we have with the term refugee. And the islands, for a long time, we struggled as to whether we should talk about this because we knew that as soon as we accepted publicly that some of us, many of us, are going to have to leave our countries, or our descendants will leave our countries forever, the major emitters who are reluctant to cut emissions to the extent that is required will immediately say, they're talking relocation. Let's help them relocate rather than cut emissions. Because the truth is, the economics of it is the truth. It's much cheaper to take 6,000 to 9,000 people off the island of Nauru, which is the smallest country in the world outside of city-states like the Vatican. It's much cheaper to take 6,000 to 9,000 people in Nauru and dump them in Australia than to take action to help them save their islands. Because don't forget, if you're going to try and save their islands, you're going to have to try and save all the coastal, low-lying coasts of the entire world, including the city of New York. So, however, the number of people forced to migrate, be that to Europe or elsewhere, shall inevitably increase as the effects of climate change worsen. Let me give you one example across the Mediterranean. Just one. Egypt has 80 million people. half of them, 40 million people, live in the Nile Delta, which is already sinking, not necessarily because of climate change. They have taken so much water out of their underground aquifers that the land itself is subsiding. At the moment, 8 million people are threatened. Doesn't mean that all 40 million will eventually have to be displaced because of climate change. However, all those millions of people, as climate change worsens, coastal erosion takes place, sea level rise, do you think all of them are going to choose to retreat back into the desert? No. At least a few million of them are going to take two boats and take the risk of crossing the Mediterranean. That is just Egypt alone. Another problem. So what has happened? I talked about the right wing, the shift towards right wing politics in Europe. That has been happening in recent years. The large influx of refugees from Eastern Europe and Africa into the European countries in the 1990s gave rise to talk of, and I'll quote here, invasion of the poor and the storming of Europe. But we should not dismiss the new radical right as fanatical parties operating on the fringe of politics. Far from it. Over time, a number of economic, social, political, and cultural arguments have been developed to justify a negative and at times hostile attitude towards immigrants who are perceived as a threat to precarious jobs and livelihoods, and to Western values and national identity and culture. And this new radical rights political discourse has struck a chord with voters across Europe in recent years, and experienced a substantial increase in electoral support, allowing it to enter into coalition governments in Austria, Netherlands, Italy, Switzerland, and Denmark. Concerns about the preservation of national identity and the nation have led the new radical right to oppose multiculturalism, which in their view promotes destruction of individual cultures. Now this will have ramifications as climate change migrants flood into Europe from around the world, especially those who find themselves without a country because their country has been covered by the ocean. The visibility of certain minorities associated with so-called alien cultures, traditions, and ways of life often fosters fear, a lack of trust, open hostility, and even xenophobia and racism against those regarded as different. This offers a great threat to climate change migrants who face an entire loss of nationhood. As I said, they have no country to go back to. While inclusive relocation policy should address the psychosocial implications of such a move, the rise of the radical right poses a threat not only to how open borders are, but also how displaced persons will be able to preserve the memory of their country, lost in part due to the emissions of the rich countries which will host them. Notwithstanding this trend, no European mainstream party has yet succeeded in halting public anxiety over immigration or stemming the rising tide of the new radical right, which need not be in power to influence the way in which governments across the EU will behave towards climate change migration. The implications for people displaced by climate change are therefore frightening. What will happen to migrants who are forced to leave their home and their country because of climate change? Who will protect them? Who will take them in? To show you how serious this situation is, I only yesterday read about how the US military is now planning to adapt to climate change. The Department of Defense's 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap, which was released this past Monday, states, and I quote, The impacts of climate change may cause instability in other countries by impairing access to food and water, damaging infrastructure, spreading disease, uprooting and displacing large numbers of people, compelling mass migration, interrupting commercial activity or restricting electricity availability. The commander of US forces in the Pacific has said that the #1 threat in the Pacific to international security is climate change. So why we're making the argument here that European climate policy or lack of or inadequacy will indirectly influence right-wing politics in Europe because of the migrant problem. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
In our globalized world, you see now why the perspectives need to be shared, why this panel brings to you this dimension of the globalization of the issues, and why we're all part of the problem as well as the solution. And with that, I would now like to introduce two professors from the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre, Brazil, from Fabio Costa Morosini, Professor of International Law at URGS, who is also the Director of a Program in Globalization, Trade, and Migration at the Federal University. And his colleague, Professor Laura Sartoretto, who is also working on this program and involved in Brazilian refugee law reform. Professor Fabio has a law degree, LLM, and PhD in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. So we're very, very pleased that he's here with us today. In addition, he has degrees from Paris 1, is Brigitte here? Yes. And SIPO. So, yes. So we're very, very pleased with honors, just learned tonight. And he brings to this his expertise in authoring numerous law review articles in English and in Portuguese. He will present the work being done in Brazil on international humanitarian law with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And he and Laura Sartoretto have a PowerPoint, actually a Prezi production to show us. Let me say just a word about Professor Laura. In addition to her law degree, has an LLM from University College in London, where her master's thesis was on European Union migration policy. So it truly is a small world. They are both involved in efforts to reform Brazilian refugee law based on a regional agreement. They will tell us about the Cartagena Agreement, enlarging the definition of refugee in the context of solidarity and burden sharing among states, and in order for states to be able to accept more persons in the category of refugee and grant asylum. Laura has also worked on the ground with migrant and refugee communities in both England and Italy. So with that, no further ado, do you need anything to set up?
Good evening. First of all, I want to thank you, the European Affairs Committee of New York City Bar Association and the European Union Studies Center of the City University of New York, and especially Catherine for making this panel possible. My colleague Fabio and I are going to give you some perspectives of refugee legislation in Latin America, and we might just light up a bit this panel because I think we have some good news for you. Only 2 weeks ago, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has released information on the Syrian conflict and has stated that more than 3 million persons have fled their homes to seek protection in other countries since the beginning of the Syrian invasion in 2011. Libya, Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea, among other states, have also engaged in conflicts that generated sheer numbers of forced migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people. The situation directly affects other parts of the world, such as neighboring underdeveloped countries, developing countries, as well as Europe. The Mediterranean Sea is one of the most important escape routes for North African asylum seekers who want to arrive in a safe place and start their lives free from persecution, and Europe seems to be the best location for them to accomplish their dreams. In Europe, migrants frequently find a different reality that often doesn't meet their dreams. In 2008, the economic crisis has deteriorated the already insufficient reception conditions for refugees and asylum seekers within the region, and has insufflated xenophobia and discrimination against that population. Despite the fact that Article 80 of the Lisbon Treaty provides that policies and the practice of the Union in the area of asylum are governed by principles of solidarity and fair sharing of responsibility, the asylum system put in place has not met its goals. Back in the 90s, the EU started the implementation of the Common European Asylum System in order to avoid secondary movements of refugees and asylum seekers and the so-called asylum shopping, as Ursula has mentioned. The cornerstone of the system is the Dublin Regulations, implemented in 2000. In applying the Dublin system, responsibility for examining asylum claims is allocated on the member states that play the most important part in the entry or residence of persons concerned in the territory of the European Union. As currently the most important escape route for refugees in North Africa is the Mediterranean Sea and the Turkish borders, the southern countries, Italy and Greece, due to their geographical location, are the most affected by forced fluxes of people. The 1951 Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugee establishes that the UNHCR mandate on persons that have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. Non-refoulement principle provided by Article 33 of the Convention requires that no person can be sent back to a territory where she or he is at risk of being tortured or suffering inhuman, degraded, and cruel treatment. Non-refoulement acquires a jus cogens status when it comes to torture, due to Article 3 of the Convention Against Torture. The problematic question thus arises when a person, a refugee or an asylum seeker, who is not persecuted on the basis of the 5 groups you see on the screen, is persecuted for other reasons, for instance, sexual orientation. In this case, states have to set up a new framework of protection. Europe has indeed created a subsidiary protection system for people that cannot be refoulement but do not meet the criteria provided by the 1951 Convention. As to Latin America, Brazil, as other 34 countries in the region, have signed the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, a non-binding agreement that is most famous for enlarging the definition of refugee. It incorporates objective elements without accounting for the subjective aspect related to the well-founded fear of persecution, articulated in the 1951 Convention. It also leaves aside any reference to the element of persecution, and that might lead to, because this element might lead to the rejection or objection of certain types of migrants, such as environmental migrants, for instance. The third conclusion of the declaration states that the definition or concept of a refugee to be recommended for the use in the region is one which, in addition to the containing elements of the 1951 Convention, includes among refugees persons who have fled their country because their lives, safety, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, international conflicts, massive violation of human rights, and other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. The Declaration addresses issues of the entire cycle of forced displacement, ranging from entry and reception of asylum seekers and refugees and their humanitarian treatment, and to the search for durable solutions while putting emphasis on voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement. The Cartagena Declaration provided the basis and the principles for Mexico Plan of Action, which is a general strategic and operational framework developed to address complex humanitarian situations resulting from forced displacement. This framework provides 3 durable solutions for refugees, being voluntary repatriation, integration in the country of first entry, and the solidarity resettlement. This program, for instance, allows Brazil and the other signatories of the Cartagena Declaration to receive refugees from refugee camps around the world and from countries that turn refugees away. Although the Mexico Plan of Action was designed to address the Colombian refugee problem, it has been used as a tool to bring to Latin America refugees from other continents, such as Palestinians and Sri Lankans, who were resettled in the city of Porto Alegre. In Brazil, in assessing refugee claims, we apply the 1951 Convention definition, the classical definition, combined with one of the groups provided by the Cartagena Declaration, the massive violation of human rights. And the country has internalized the non-binding instrument in our 1994 Refugee Act, making it enforceable in Brazil. Latin America in general, and Brazil in particular, have a long tradition of regional cooperation and solidarity towards refugees. Currently, Latin America hosts the smallest number of refugees of any region. Although one country, Colombia, has one of the largest populations of internally displaced people. Brazil and Latin America have today the right context for increasing resettlement numbers as well as improving refugees' reception conditions in the region. Brazil in particular has got potential, is willing and able to receiving, recognizing and integrating refugees and asylum seekers in our society. Thank you very much.
I'll keep on the optimistic side then. I'll be explaining a little bit what academia has done in Brazil to contribute and improve the situation of forced migration and especially refugees. So I will now explain the main points of a new project we have implemented in our law school concerning international refugee law and policy. It's called the Sergio Vieira de Mello program. It has been instrumental in advancing international refugee law and policy. The Sergio Vieira de Mello program was established in 2003 by the UNHCR to honor the Brazilian UN Commissioner for Human Rights killed in Iraq in that same year. This program takes place all over Latin America, and it's open for universities to recognize the role of academia in the promotion of human rights of refugees. It is based on a 3-pillar framework: teaching, research, and community engagement. Today, in Brazil, there are 11 up and running Sergio Vieira de Mello programs, of which our university is one of them. As a result of this program, The first pillar, teaching. At the graduate level, our law school offers now a course on international refugee law. We're currently structuring an LLM program specialized on migration and refugee law. It's a multidisciplinary program. And at the undergraduate level, the teaching of international refugee law has been integrated into the general course of international law. As the second pillar, and also because of the program, now we have one standing multidisciplinary group on international refugee law, which gathers students from international relations, from law, sociology, political sciences, and public affairs. And there's also a joint research program which congregates 11 of these programs in Brazil. And we're currently engaged in revising the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, especially oriented towards the enlargement of the definition of refugee to include environmental displacement, refugee status based on sexual orientation, and also crisis migrants due to humanitarian threats. And the third pillar of the program is community engagement. And in our law school, we have been a pioneer program in establishing a law clinic in 2007, specialized in assisting refugees and migrants. This is a guided program. This clinic has achieved great success. In 2013, for example, the clinic succeeded in its claim before the university to implement an affirmative action program for refugees. So now the university is in the process of developing a special entrance exam for refugees. In addition, our program is part of a state-level working group in charge of creating guidelines on labor rights for migrants in Brazil. In sum, this project has proved to be successful in terms of increasing awareness on forced migration movements with direct impact on governmental action, civil society engagement, and lawmaking. In December 2014, delegates from all of the signatory countries of the declaration, the Cartagena Declaration, just mentioned by my colleague, will gather in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, to update the actual text of the declaration. Top priorities of this summit include expanding the refugee definition. So currently, as mentioned by Laura, the definition of refugee includes the 1951 definition, plus generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, and other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. The December 2014 summit considers enlarging this concept to encompass environmentally displaced persons, those persecuted on the basis of sexual orientation, and persons threatened by humanitarian crisis. The second pillar, or the second priority of the summit, is establishing a complementary system. Signatory countries cannot return migrants to their country of origin or elsewhere if they risk being tortured due to the jus cogens nature of the principle of non-refoulement. However, these migrants do not fall under the definition of refugee, which leaves them in a limbo of protection. To address this problem, as our colleagues have mentioned, the EU has created a complementary system which offers temporary protection in cases of massive influx of migrants and humanitarian protection in situations of widespread human rights violations. On the other hand, Latin America has not yet developed such a system with binding effect. However, some countries in the region, such as Brazil, provide an ad hoc protection framework for individuals under these situations. The ultimate goal of the 2014 summit is then to encourage countries to create such a permanent and binding system. And the third top priority of this summit in 2014 is rethinking burden sharing. Presently, the burden is not fairly shared among Latin American countries. For instance, Ecuador has borne disproportionate responsibility in accepting and integrating Colombian refugees fleeing from persecution in their country. Contrary to the recommendations of the Cartagena Declaration, solidarity in burden sharing, countries in Latin America have not offered assistance to Ecuador in the management of massive influx of people. This led Ecuador in recent years to take a less expensive reading of the definition of refugee, applying the stricter 1951 Convention refugee definition. The 2014 summit then seeks to encourage states to open their borders to regional and international refugees by using the framework of the 2004 Mexico Plan of Action, boosting their resettlement projects, which leads us to the next slide. The Cartagena Declaration created alternative solutions to deal with the problem of forced migrants, as already mentioned by Laura. Those are voluntary repatriation, local integration, and the third solution on resettlement. This solution is based on 3 pillars: solidarity towards refugees, burden sharing among receiving countries, and prioritizing most vulnerable refugees. However, this solution has had limited success, which led Brazil to propose a new approach to resettlement, leading to the 4th durable solution. This 4th solution has been named Labor Migration Pilot Project, and it explores 3 complementary approaches, all taking place before a person enters the host country. So the first complementary approach, refugee capacity building to contribute to the Brazilian workforce. This type of resettlement will not take into account individuals' vulnerability, which is debatable according to current regulation, and will also focus on the Colombian refugees, in Ecuador. The second complementary approach intends, through the project, to acquaint refugees with Brazilian language and culture due to the linguistic difficulties, especially for those outside of Latin America. And the third complementary approach of this 4th durable solution is offering ideal reception conditions through the establishment of partnerships between the public sector, private sector, and civil society. Brazil already adopts such an approach. So let's look at some numbers now. Brazil holds a great potential to integrate migrants. However, currently, Brazil has only approximately 1 million migrants, which is insignificant in a country with over 200 million people. Out of these, 5,256 are asylum seekers. In comparison, from January 2014 until today, Italy has received around 70,000 asylum seekers. In total, Brazil currently has 7,000 refugees and 10,000 people under another solution called humanitarian visa. So what is the relation between application and granting of asylum in Brazil currently? From 2012 to 2013, the asylum application increased by 800%, especially due to applications from Syrian asylum seekers. And I'll probably go to our conclusions because we have a few more slides, and I'm happy to go back to them, showing that refugee seekers have increased from people outside of the region to especially those from Syria lately. So these take us to some preliminary conclusions on our study. The first conclusion is that the principle of solidarity must play a greater role on refugee burden sharing among states. Second conclusion on resettlement. Resettlement projects should receive more attention and investment from states in the region and from the UNHCR. Third, Latin America has a progressive framework on refugee protection that may be a model for other countries and regions. And finally, that Brazil may make a significant contribution receiving and integrating refugees from other parts of the world, including the European Union. Thank you very much.
Very happy that Fabio and Laura were able to join us tonight. Thank you so much for that contribution and a positive note. I also would just like to acknowledge that when Sergio Rivera died in the bomb that exploded, he was visiting Arthur Helton, an American attorney who was a member of the New York City Bar Association, and sorely missed. He had done a great deal of work in granting and in making applications for others to be granted asylum here in the United States, and then lost his life in this way, serving the U.S. government. All right, our final speaker is Dr. Martin Shane, a noted expert on the European Union, professor at NYU in the Department of Politics, co-editor of the Journal of Comparative European Politics, and the general editor of the Palsgrave Press series on Europe in Transition. We could think of no better person to be our final speaker to give the analysis that we'll need now to pull all of these strands together. He has held leadership positions in the European Studies Association, the American Political Science Association, and has authored numerous books and articles, including two worth mentioning, a book on the politics of immigration in 2012, and a prize-winning book on comparative immigration policies in the UK, France, and the US in 2006. Professor Shane serves as president of the European Studies Association and was director at NYU's Center for European Studies for many years. Now, and after your remarks, Professor, I will give the panelists a chance to respond or to add whatever they wish based on what they've heard tonight, after which we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Professor Shane.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm very pleased to be on this panel of distinguished and interesting and important people. Some of what I have to say is from Truth in Advertising. I'm working on a book called Borders, which deals with politics of borders in Europe and the United States. So at least some of what I have to say comes out of this new work that I'm doing. I'd like to talk really about four things and speak as briefly as I can. The first is something of a reaction to much of what I heard just now this evening. The second really deals with some way we can approach how can we understand the current border crisis in Europe today, for that matter, the current border crisis in the United States. The third, what exactly is the issue of immigration? It means different things to different people, or rather different things to different political people. And finally, is there a common policy, to what extent is there a common policy of immigration in Europe today? Or for that matter, I made some notes to myself, to what extent is there a policy of immigration in any European country that we can understand in some way? So let me begin by trying to put some things into perspective. And I have the impression, and you must have the impression as well, that there is an enormous crisis of entry of illegal immigrants into Europe as we speak here tonight. We know the numbers, we've seen the pictures, it's in the news every day, and it's particularly in the news with regard to Italy. My only reaction to this is, in some sense, there is a crisis at the moment, but there is no crisis of undocumented entry into Europe, more generally speaking. That is, it's the difference between a snapshot and a picture. The snapshot is clear enough. The picture is somewhat larger. Let me see if I can paint the picture a little bit larger for you. By and large, 90%, maybe a bit fewer this year, of people who are undocumented in Europe are visa overstays. They didn't arrive at Lampedusa. They didn't arrive in some of the other places I'll refer to in a moment. They arrived at Roissy Airport in Paris. They arrived in the UK. They arrived at airports. They come in quite legally. Some of them may very well be my students. And they stay. And they stay, and they become undocumented immigrants because they have overstayed their visas. And so we are dealing with roughly 10% of the undocumented immigrants, maybe a little more this year, who are in Europe today, who've come in those boats, and who've come in roughly, largely, 2 places in Europe. Most people who come into Europe come through airports. But there are those who come in, that is, who come in undocumented by land and by sea. The least number of people who are undocumented have come in by sea in those boats. It doesn't diminish for a moment what we're seeing in those pictures. The second number of people who come in undocumented come in other places in Europe. They come in through Spain, for example. That is roughly 60, 70, 80% of people who are undocumented who come in through land, come in mostly through the Spanish enclaves in North Africa, Ceuta and Melilla. You've perhaps seen pictures of those as well, because there are periodic crises there. The European Union has contributed to building a wall, a fence, depending on the word you like best, but there is a significant wall around these enclaves that people penetrate nevertheless. And this is where people by land come through. Increasingly, people by land are coming through from Turkey to Greece and Bulgaria. There too, the European Union has contributed towards building, I'd say this particularly in Eastern Europe, towards building walls. And so, while this is certainly not a pretty picture, that's not a pretty picture, and the walls that I'm speaking of are not pretty pictures, I would argue that, in fact, the problem of undocumented entry, undocumented staying in Europe, in fact, is a relatively minor problem. Relatively minor. Relative to what? Well, of course, relative to the United States. The number of undocumented immigrants in Europe, if we take the statements by ministries of the interior, which tend to be the largest number, represent something less than 1% of the population of the largest countries of immigration in Europe. Maybe 2/3 of 1% in France, maybe verging on 1% in the UK, and I can give you more numbers, but it's not important. But it's roughly 1%. In the United States, the number of undocumented immigrants who are resident now in the United States, by most informed estimates, is roughly 4% of the population. We have an undocumented immigrant problem. Europe, not so much. There was a major European study that was done, it's now dated, in between 2007 and 2009, called Clandestino, which I love the name of the study. Many of the numbers, many of the informed estimates of undocumented immigrants come out of this study that was sponsored by the European Commission. Okay, that's perspective. The second thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is the current border crisis, such as it is, in the European area. There are, in fact, three not entirely related border crises, one of which we did not speak about today. The first is the asylum issue. The asylum issue is very real. And whereas many countries, in fact, all countries which have signed the 1951 Geneva Agreement, countries who have signed the European Convention on Human Rights, have all committed themselves to accepting asylum seekers on a reasonable basis. There isn't a single country of which I know which is delighted to accept asylum seekers. That is, if you have one or two, that's fine. You have a dozen, that's okay. When they start coming by the thousands and the tens of thousands, this creates a problem. And indeed, the real policies of all European countries, and indeed the real policy of the United States, is to proclaim these principles, to accept them for the most part, and to do whatever they can to accept as few as possible. The asylum issue really represents that. That is, this is the asylum issue. Entry from the Mediterranean to Italy a few years ago was Malta. Land entry into Greece and Bulgaria, mostly from Turkey. The result has been, of course, periodic crises. Periodic crises which give you the impression, and in fact give European populations the impression, that Europe is under invasion. And this, among other things, has also fed the politics of the extreme right in Europe. And I'm not saying that these pictures are not real, they shouldn't be shown, but in fact, these become part of the political process, and they're used intensely in the political process as well. The second issue of entry is land entry into Spain, which has been problematic since the early to mid-1990s. This is a mix of economic migration and some asylum seekers. These are people coming from poorer countries in Africa. These are people who are also, by the way, fleeing anarchy and civil war. That has been the condition of a good part of Africa for a very long time. Then there is there is the third problem, what is now being called a crisis of entry into Europe, and this one was somewhat unexpected. And that involves EU citizens who by right can travel and enter other EU countries. This has become a major issue in British politics, as some of you may know. It's become something less than a major issue in French and German politics, but there is no question that it is sweeping across Europe as an issue in and of itself, and that is the right of movement, free movement for European citizens. This is a right that's well established under the treaties of Rome. This is a right that has been augmented under the Schengen Accords. This is a right that is now being challenged, and it's being challenged quite vocally by the current British government, which will take this issue into the next election next year. So that we really are dealing with very different kinds of issues, and we're dealing with an increasing and a certain unacceptability of migrants, of immigrants, and the current emphasis on EU citizens makes us aware of the fact that Europe is not quite Europe yet. I myself, who live in Manhattan, have often thought I'd like to see fewer cars from New Jersey cruising my streets, but I would not make this an election issue if I were running for office. This is, in fact, become a major election issue, and it is given more focus by the integration into Europe of Bulgaria and Romania, and the movement of Roma peoples across Europe into all major countries in Europe. And there is a high sense of rejection. Despite the fact that they are European citizens, have a right to travel, there have been incidents in Europe that have gone on, electoral issues that have gone on, we can talk about it some other time, since 2010. The third thing I want to mention to you is exactly what is the issue of immigration. I mean, what does it mean in Europe and the United States? The core issue of immigration, at least until recently, has not been the border in Europe. In Europe, the core issue of immigration has been questions of integration. That is, are these people integratable into European countries? Whatever these people are. And in most European countries, these people have not been considered to be other Europeans, although the issue of Polish plumbers has certainly come up. But these people have generally been considered to be people from North Africa and Africa south of the Sahara. Questions of integration have dominated the politics of immigration in European politics for several decades now. And more recently, the issue of integration has been related to issues of entry. Integration criteria have been applied to make entry more difficult. That is, those people who, by certain measurements, whether it's language, whether it's cultural ability, who are deemed to be less integratable into European societies, have been, if not stopped at the gates, certainly their entry into Europe has been made more difficult at the gates. But what's interesting about it is that the integration issue has been applied, generally speaking, as well to settled populations. And it's been applied in two ways. Firstly, it's been applied in terms of the political construction of immigration issues, particularly by the extreme right, but not only by the extreme right. Secondly, it's been applied in the evolution of the development of citizenship requirements. Increasingly, citizenship requirements in major European countries require demonstration of integratability in various ways. So that this has been the major issue of immigration within Europe, not so much border questions, which helps to account for the fact that, that Europe, in fact, has applied relatively small resources to controlling the border. A recent report came out of the United States from the Migration Policy Institute, which indicated that the United States is now spending $18 billion a year on border control. That is more on border control than we see as a police action that is spent on all other police forces in the United States. This is certainly not true in Europe. And as Frontex is, which was mentioned here earlier, Frontex, the European Border Agency, is funded at the level of maximum 85 to 90 million euros a year. There's other funding for border control in Europe, special funds that have been mentioned during the course of our discussions here. Doesn't even come close to the $18 billion a year spent by the United States on border control. It's the border in the United States that is the major immigration issue. And it's the border as it is applied to undocumented entry. We are obsessed here in the United States with undocumented entry, particularly through our southern border. But there is an irony to this. We have separated in our minds, and we have certainly separated in our politics, illegal entry from legal entry. At the same time that we were obsessed by illegal entry, which in fact is diminished almost to zero in the United States today, net entry through our southern border. We continue to admit over 1 million legal immigrants per year, and in all 3 legislative proposals that have been passed somewhere in Congress, but of course not become law because they only passed somewhere in Congress, there are also provisions for the expansion of legal entry. Because what we call immigration reform is in fact reform on how we treat illegal entry and illegal entrance. At the same time, there are proposals, the machine goes on, there are proposals for increases, significant increases in legal entry into the United States. And finally, the issue of immigration in the United States is not in any real sense related to policies of integration. There are people who argue that in the United States we have no policies of integration. I would argue that we do. But in any case, this is not a serious discussion in the United States, that is whether we should admit immigrants on the basis of their integrability. This has not always been true. That is, in American immigration policy prior to the First World War and just after the First World War, we were deeply concerned with the integratability of Eastern and Southern Europeans, which is why we tried to exclude them. But this is simply no longer true in America, which makes immigration policy in America and Europe really very, very different. Fourthly, is there a common immigration policy in Europe? For that matter, is there an immigration policy in any major country in Europe in the sense that we understand it in the United States? That is there legislation which says we will admit up to X number of people on the basis of the following categories? And although there are nuances of this in Europe, the answer is basically no. No, there is no immigration policy in any major country in Europe which resembles the kind of immigration policy we have in the United States. I don't know if ours is better, but in fact, what passes for immigration policy throughout most of Europe is a kind of tinkering and ad hoc policy that admits people either on the basis of labor market requirements, as in the UK, or on the basis of various administrative decisions, as it is through most of Europe. As for the EU, there is some regulation, that is, there is a commitment to developing a common immigration policy. And there is some regulation, yes, but there is no common enforcement mechanism. And in fact, there is no common commitment to certain kinds of immigration policies, in part because most immigration policy is left to the member states. The really important stuff is left to the member states. The common policy on asylum, and there are some common policies on asylum, as you know, is essentially unworkable. It's unworkable, as my colleague to my right will certainly attest, because the countries that are most responsible for, in the context of the Dublin rules, enable the countries which are less responsible in the context of the Dublin rules, that is the countries that are on the periphery of Europe, really have the responsibility, and the countries that are not on the periphery of Europe have much less responsibility, but certainly they maintain their responsibility to criticize. It's not just that they retain their responsibility to criticize, they in fact hold peripheral countries, particularly Italy, responsible for maintaining the common European border, despite the fact that large numbers of people who are entering Lampedusa, and who've been doing this, by the way, since 2010, 2011, somehow seem to find their way to France. And the French have then sent them back there. It's a whole story. I was asked to end on a more positive note, so let me end on a more positive note. And I have in my notes, nevertheless, there is a far more positive note that I can end on. There is a growing importance that scholars have begun to analyze and understand, a growing importance of protections in the rule of law for some aspects of immigration in Europe, particularly family unification and limits placed by EU directives and by the European Court of Justice on expulsions. And so we can thank, as my colleagues who are writing about these things have said and have written, we can thank the European Court of Justice for limitations on deportation and detentions, but we can also thank the European Council and the European Commission for directives such as the Family Unification Directive of 2003, which gives greater guarantees to what European countries are committed to, and that is the unification of families. So that's my positive.
That was very positive. I think if I may just add to that, the concept would be that if someone has crossed the border and entered the EU, then they must be examined as to whether they qualify as a refugee. And while they're under determination that their status is not yet settled, they're not free to move about, including children, even if they had an aunt or a grandparent somewhere else in Europe. And so now, under this family directive, family reunification, they can go to the family. Thank you. This is very, very rich. I'd like to just ask if the panelists and one who would like, Mr. Ambassador, I know that you may have to leave us soon. So if you had a final thought or two you could share with us, or any interaction with any of the other panelists.
Yes, thank you. Well, maybe on Steve's side, I do stress that, generally speaking terms, the history of migration in Italy is a successful history. We have had phenomenon of far-right parties that built the success on the fear of migration, especially in the north of Italy. And being a product of the south of Italy, I know these dynamics also among the Italians. But basically now it's over. There is no, Italy is one of the few countries now that basically has no far-right party strong, like happened in France, like happened in Northern Europe. This is really very intriguing results. And for instance, what I also said about the internal migration of Europe, we host the largest Romanian community abroad, basically because the languages are very similar. So there are thousand Romanian that lives, and they are now part of the Italian economy. They play an important role. What is happening now? It's the crisis that actually is happening now. It's more linked to current and very difficult situation on the other part of the sea, and also to the fact that the great majority of the people who arrived in Sicily, crossing the sea, they do not want to stay in Italy. basically they are, especially if I take only 1,000 Syrians, the number I mentioned earlier, the main objective of those people is going to Germany and Sweden, where there are the largest Syrian community in Europe. The problem is that with the current regulation, current law that we, as you say by the way, until they have any sort of regulation as an asylum seeker or whatever, you are obliged to stay in the first European country where you enter. And they do not want to stay. If you go in those days, in those last weeks in Milan, and you go to the central station of Milan, that by the way is a very beautiful building, this is full, packed of people living there, sleeping there, a lot of unaccompanied minor trying to cross the border or going to Austria, Germany, and then Sweden. And there are a lot of, and they have of course no right to go to the train to cross the border because then they are sent back. So this is a very peculiar situation now, it's complicated this situation. But I agree that in general framework, in the general picture, it's a history of success, and maybe it's also a history for the future of my country. You know, Italy is one of the lowest birth rates in the world, so this is something that helped my country to keep going. So maybe this is a positive conclusion.
I just wanted to say something about birth rates. I'm not sure exactly what Italians decide to stop having children, but it certainly flies in the face of all images that people have in the United States of Italy for a very long time. But it's not just Italy, it's true Italy has almost a unique position in Europe with regard to the country of birth rate. But this is something of a problem throughout Europe, and it's a very, very serious problem in Central and Eastern Europe, which are losing population, and will lose vast amounts of population relative to the present time by 2050 if all this works out according to prediction. But it's also true, I mean, France has one of the highest birth rates in Europe, but they're not quite reproducing their population. And low birth rates are characteristic of all of Europe. And I usually start my course on immigration with this fact. And you would think that European countries would be delighted to have more migrants, but no, they're not. I mean, they might be if they could pick and choose which immigrants they have. They would probably like all the people in this room to migrate. That would be a good idea. But in immigration, you can't be quite so picky and choosy. So yeah, I mean, the Italian situation that you mentioned at the end is a kind of footnote, is really the story of Europe today.
Generally, when we look at the climate negotiations, we've all heard the politics of climate change. We've heard a lot about the economics of climate change, especially in recent weeks here at the UN. But the area where we're very weak is on legal issues. And it's because I think people perceive something like climate migration as something far in the future. I know that Columbia University is working a lot with the Pacific Islands at present to talk about the issue of migration, because migration has been happening in the Pacific for a long time. It's not happening for climate change issues or reasons. But we have problems until our Brazilian colleagues spoke about for environmental refugees or migrants or relocated people. Is this concept of refugees. It has never wrapped its mind around people relocated for climate reasons, weather-related reasons. For example, no one has looked at the possibility of an entire country migrating. What if the government on an island somewhere decides we all have to relocate. They never made an announcement, but the president of Kiribati, President Tong, was astounded when he went on CNN and became the first president ever to admit publicly it's too late to save us. That takes a lot of courage for an elected president to do. To say, well, the fact maybe that he can't stand for election again may have something to do with it. But the issue is, when people, if they have to migrate, what are the rights of a government that relocates? The 4 countries I mentioned, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Maldives, they're a maximum of 3 meters, 10 feet above sea level rise. So the prospect of one day the government saying things are untenable and we all have to leave, rather than you assume they will have negotiated with a country or some countries as to the legalities and all the legal issues that are involved. But what if, for example, the country disappears and the only thing left are oil rigs? What happens to your exclusive economic zone when the country disappears? So the oil rigs pay the money, the royalties, to whom? Yeah, there's a whole issue of legal issues around the issue of climate change that is relatively little touched. It's beginning to come to the fore now, because for those of you who follow climate change, we've gone through phases. The first was mitigation, which means basically cutting emissions. When that failed, we went into the adaptation sphere, which is adapting to the damage caused by climate change, which is another sphere. And where adaptation has failed or has been inadequate, which is the case in both, we are now in what is called loss and damage, which is where there is irreparable damage. And now the issue of migration is coming to the fore as loss and damage. And we're having, as usual, a huge fight about it in the climate negotiations. So this thing about climate migration is just part of this whole issue where lawyers around the world haven't really gotten together. And it's not just about migration, it's also about the UN Law of the Sea, for example, the Convention on the Law of the Sea on the issue of maritime borders and especially exclusive economic zones. If Seychelles won't disappear, we have a huge, the largest European fishing fleet outside of Europe is in Seychelles waters, on 42 sailors. If Seychelles was to disappear, this is purely hypothetical, they won't disappear, we'll become economically unviable, we'll become a failed state maybe. And the fleets continue fishing our waters, what happens? Who has rights over the fish? That impacts on when we migrate, finding money to feed the people. And don't forget, when climate migration happens, one of the differences with other types of migration is when climate migration happens, people will migrate to countries that have an internal climate migration problem of their own. Because when they migrate to these other countries, by then we'll have runaway climate change, all coastlines will be in danger. So all continents will you'll have to redraw the whole world map because all continents, the boundaries will change, the beaches and coastlines will change. So that puts an added problem on governments to accept climate migrants because they will be dealing with a internal climate migration away from the sea. So there's a whole plethora of legal issues, and relatively no one has really started, apart from a few academic institutions like Columbia University and some others in the US, have really started attacking this problem. So it's part of a much bigger problem. Thank you.
So, as to what Ambassador Lambertini was saying, in 2013, I worked in the city of Catania with migrants and refugees there. Catania is in the state of Sicily, and it's true that migrants, what we call as communitarian migrants, people from Bulgaria and Romania, they were the ones in the worst situation in Catania, worse than the refugees from North Africa, for instance. So, and I know that in London they also have this kind of migration because people within the Schengen area, they have 3 months to travel to another state within the European Union so they can settle there and find work. And if they don't find in 3 months, then they have to return to their countries. So they stay there for 3 months and then they kind of stay illegally. And as the ambassador of the Seychelles Islands were talking about the environmental problems, I was thinking about prevention. And not preventing people from entering in states or for applying for asylum, but prevention in the causes that generate refugees. And we can prevent these causes in the field of the environmental system, but we also can prevent refugees from fleeing their homes because of, for instance, civil wars, foreign aggression, and other conflicts that generate refugees and forced migrants. Mainly because in the concept of the principle of responsibility to protect and responsibility while protecting, countries that generate this kind of forced fluxes of people, they are indeed responsible for the effects of this kind of conflicts generate. So I think we should address, in the future, we should address more the issue of prevention, preventing people from leaving their homes. Because if you talk to refugees, and I've talked to many of them, none of them have said to me that they want to leave their houses. Even though if it was a very poor country in Africa, or really poor situations, even though they wanted to stay in their homes and have their lives there, but they had to flee because they are fleeing persecution, they are fleeing torture, they were afraid of many reasons we cannot even grasp. So I think to address this problem, the question of prevention, and I think then in the environmental issues also, the question of prevention is really, really important, because you cannot close your borders and do not let people in your country. Not only because of the international legal framework, because you are violating the principle of non-refoulement, but also because people that want to flee, they always find a way. So.
Just wanted to add one sentence in the spirit of positive counsel, which we are ending, and a big comment to Professor Shane's presentation. Professor said there is no EU immigration policy. That was that conclusion, but I think so.
You made it agree with me.
What I'm saying is that I think there is hope in the new competence of the European Parliament. We have proven in the past to be the driving force of European solidarity and European democracy, and we are fairly new to the area, but I think at one point we'll get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that positive note, actually, everyone. I'd like to recognize Dr. Patricia Nove, the co-host of this whole event, and a great teammate here working on this program. And if you'd like to open up with any questions on health, we have students here from Seton Hall University, from the School of Diplomacy. They have microphones we're going to be passing around. We were also met at the door tonight by some of the other students from the School of Diplomacy. And if there's someone who would like to either ask a question to the panelists, please make it not a statement, a question. Yes. Where's the mic? Okay. John, if you can bring the mic over here, please. And if it's a question to a particular panelist, please, it's to this gentleman here first.